Henry is indefensible. That means it's vulnerable or it's going to be hard to attack. Very vulnerable, okay? He was very concerned that he could hold Fort Henry at all, okay? Well, on top of that, by February 1st of 1862, the Tennessee River was over its banks. It was flooding. And so basically, it threatened to flood all of Fort Henry as well. So the Tennessee River is at the top of its banks. Actually, it's overflowing. And there was a big threat that Fort Henry would be flooded. Well, on February 4th and February 5th of 1862, General Grant landed 2 different Union divisions on 2 different locations near Fort Henry. On February 4th and February 5th of 1862, Union General Grant landed 2 different Union divisions in 2 different locations near Fort Henry. One of Grant's divisions landed on the east bank of the Tennessee River. He put one of his divisions on the east bank of the Tennessee River. And he stuck his other division on what was considered the high ground on the Kentucky side of Fort Henry. In other words, the northern side of Fort Henry. So Grant, on February 4th and 5th of 1862, he lands 2 different Union divisions in 2 different locations near Fort Henry. One of his divisions was placed on the east bank of the Tennessee River, and another division was placed on the high ground on the northern section of Fort Henry on what they call the Kentucky side. And they basically are going to attack 2 different ways. They're going to attack on the Tennessee River and on the high ground. So they're going to combine a land and gunboat attack on Fort Henry. And they do this on February 6th. On February 6th, 1862, the Union used a combined land and gunboat attack, and they actually captured Fort Henry in about 75 minutes. It was over. 75 minutes. So on February 6, 1862, using a combined land and gunboat attack, the Union captured Fort Henry in a little more than an hour, about 75 minutes. And casualties were pretty minimal. The Union lost 40 men, and the Confederates lost 79, much less than the thousands that we had talked about before. So the Union lost 40 men in the capture of Fort Henry, and the Confederates lost 79 men. So where is Grant going next?
To
Fort Donelson. Very good. Thanks, Emily. So after capturing Fort Henry, General Grant's going to march his 15,000 troops 12 miles straight towards Fort Donelson. So after capturing Fort Henry, General Grant is going to take his 15,000 Union troops and march 12 miles to Fort Donelson. Now, although General Albert Johnson was in command of Confederate troops in Tennessee, the fort was under the command of two different generals. So Fort Donelson was under the command of General Simon B. Buckner and John B. Floyd. So Fort Donelson, the next target for the Union, is commanded by Confederate Generals Simon B. Buckner and John B. Floyd. So they're preparing because they know Grant is coming. He's marching 12 miles. When did he attack and secure Fort Henry?
February 6th.
Okay, and he arrived at Fort Donelson on February 12th. February 12th, 1862, General Grant and his Union forces arrived at Fort Donelson. And they basically fought for the next 2 days. They fought for the next 2 days. And when the fighting commenced or ended, there was little or no gain on either side. So they really fought at Fort Donelson the first 2 days hard and with little gain on either side. Well, the night of February 14th, which is pretty close to coming up here, what's the weather like here, February 14th?
Cold.
Cold. Also very cold in Tennessee that time of the year. And on the night of February 14th, it turned bitter cold. Very, very cold that night. It was so cold that men on both sides, both Union and Confederate soldiers, marched all night just to keep from freezing. They really couldn't lay down and go to sleep. It was that cold, they were afraid they would freeze. Matter of fact, what do you think happened to a lot of those wounded soldiers from the first 2 days that night?
They died.
They died, yep. So many of the soldiers on both sides that were wounded in the fighting the first 2 days froze to death that night of the 14th. Another thing happened that night, the night of the 14th. General Floyd lost his nerve and fled the fort. Can you believe that? The general fled the fort, lost his nerve and fled, leaving General Buckner in charge. So that night of the 14th, General John B. Floyd lost his nerve and fled the fort, which left General Buckner in command of the rebel forces. You know why he left? You know why he lost his nerve? That would be Floyd. He used to serve in the Union government, and he thought if he was going to be captured, what would happen? Say it.
Charged with
He'd be charged with treason, and what do they do with someone that's charged with treason at that time? Hang him. That's exactly right, Delaney. Very good. So Floyd had served in the Union government, and he was terrified that if he was captured at Fort Donelson, because he worked for the Union government and now was fighting for the South, that they would try him for treason and he would be hung. So he departs the fort. Well, the next morning of the 15th, Buckner can see that he's grossly outnumbered and he has no chance of winning or holding the fort. So what does he do? He surrenders to General Grant. So the next day on the 15th, after seeing that his forces were grossly outnumbered, in no shape to fight, Confederate General Buckner surrendered to General Grant. Now, what do you do after you surrender? You ask for the what? As always, when you surrender, you want what? What are going to be the blank of surrender? Are men going to be treated right? You know, what's going to happen? Terms of surrender. So normally, after a loss or you surrender in a battle, the loser asks for the terms of surrender. So during the time he surrendered, General Buckner asked Union General Grant, hey, what are going to be the terms if I surrender? Grant informed Buckner there would be no terms of surrender. He would accept only Buckner's unconditional surrender. So Grant was a little hardcore. When Confederate General Buckner asked Union General Grant for the terms of surrender, General Grant informed General Buckner there would be no terms of surrender, that he would only accept Buckner's unconditional surrender. What does that mean? Well, yeah, we'll do whatever we want to. We're not giving you any conditions. You're surrendering, and we'll do what we feel we want to. From that point on in the history of the Civil War, General Grant became known as Unconditional Surrender Grant. In other words, you knew if you surrendered to General Grant, you weren't getting any terms. The terms would be whatever he wanted to do. So from that point in history, General Grant earned the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. Now, what does this victory at Fort Donelson and Fort Henry give the Union? Their first victories of the Civil War. They're 0-1, right? Before that, because they lost at the First Battle of Bull Run. So this gives the Union their first major victory in the Civil War. However, the Confederate losses at Fort Donelson were devastating. And I'll give you the examples. First of all, I should go back and tell you, the Union suffered 2,331 casualties. Dead, wounded, captured. 2,331. That's what they suffered at Fort Donelson. I'm going to give you 5 examples of how devastating this loss was for the South at Fort Donelson. So how many did the Union lose there, Dane?
2,331.
Okay, Confederate casualties, 15,067. 15,000, 5 times as many, maybe 6, depending on the math. 15,067 Confederate casualties. Now, to tell you the truth, that was just killed or wounded, because 15,000 more Confederates were taken prisoner of war at Fort Donelson. So even though not much ground was accomplished in the first 2 days of fighting, who suffered the most casualties that made the South very outnumbered that led to Buckner's surrender? The South. On top of those casualties, more than 20,000 Confederate arms were taken by the North. More than 20,000 Confederate arms were taken by the North. What's a piece of artillery? Cannons. Okay? Some are more powerful. You've got cannons that are more powerful than others. Well, at the Battle of Fort Donelson, 48 Southern pieces of artillery were seized. 48, including 17 which they considered heavy guns or heavy cannons. Hard to come by. So not only were there 15,067 Confederate casualties and almost 15,000 Confederates taken prisoner of war and more than 20,000 Confederate arms taken by the North, they also seized 48 Southern pieces of artillery, including 17 heavy guns. And what else might be important that the Union take from the Confederacy that would weaken them? Horses from the cavalry. And the North took about 3,000 Confederate horses at Fort Donelson also. So this was a devastating loss for the South. Devastating. But that did not secure Tennessee yet for the Union. It secured those 2 forts. The final battle in Tennessee is going to be the Battle of Bloody Shiloh. The Battle of Bloody Shiloh. Ever heard the Battle of Shiloh? Anybody? The Battle of Bloody Shiloh, and it got its name for a reason, happened on April 6th, 1862. And it happened at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee. Where at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee? At Shiloh Chapel. So on April 6th, 1862, we have the Battle of Bloody Shiloh at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, at Shiloh Chapel. What was Pittsburgh Landing? It was a town in Tennessee. Actually, it was a riverboat settlement on the Tennessee River. Okay, it's a riverboat settlement on the Tennessee River. Pittsburgh Landing. And what happened on April 6th of 1862, Union soldiers were resting at Shiloh Chapel. And again, Shiloh Chapel was located at Pittsburgh Landing, Tennessee, which was a riverboat settlement on the Tennessee River. Who was commanding Confederate troops still in Tennessee? General who? Albert Johnston. And he and his troops are about 24 miles from Pittsburgh Landing at the time. And Grant and his men are resting at Shiloh Chapel, not expecting any battle. Okay? So Confederate General Albert Johnson and his troops were stationed about 24 miles from Pittsburgh Landing, as Union soldiers under the command of Grant are resting at Shiloh Chapel, not expecting a battle. Well, Albert Johnson decided his best bet was to stage a surprise attack upon the Union forces at Shiloh Chapel. So that's what he does. Okay? He surprise attacks the Union, tries to catch them off guard. The first day of battle at Shiloh Chapel, both sides fought furiously for 6 hours, with the South winning the day. So the first day of the Battle of Shiloh, both sides fight furiously for 6 hours, and the South wins the day. Well, the Union receives reinforcements, they fight back, and they push the Confederates all the way back to Corinth, Tennessee. They push the rebels all the way back to Corinth, Tennessee. So the Union, after losing the first day, fight off the stubborn rebels, and they push them back to Corinth, Tennessee. Well, this battle cost a lot of lives, 23,746 in the two-day battle. 23,746 casualties on both sides. 23,746 casualties on both sides. Just kind of a round them off thing. About 13,000 Union soldiers were killed, and approximately a little over 10,000 Confederate soldiers. So a big loss of life on this battle. You're looking almost 24,000 casualties. 13,000 Union soldiers, a little over 10,000 Confederates. Among the casualties and the fatalities was General Albert Johnson himself, who was killed at Shiloh. Shouldn't have been, but he did get killed. What happened to poor Albert Johnston is he suffered a leg wound, a mini ball. You know what a mini ball looks like? Nicked an artery in his right leg. A mini ball nicked an artery in his right leg. This is a mini ball. I'll pass it around. This is what a mini ball looks like. This is a mini ball right here that was found near Appomattox Courthouse during the surrender of General Lee. But this is a Confederate mini ball right there. Unions were very similar. So that there mini ball had nicked an artery in Johnston's right leg. Now, according to historians, it was not a fatal wound, but it did cost General Johnston's life. If they would have just applied a tourniquet to his leg in time, he would have lived. And Johnston actually had one in his pocket, but no one around him really knew how to use it or where to put it. So he actually had one, but it wasn't used. Now, as was common in the Civil War, General Johnson had a personal physician assigned to him that could have very easily fixed him up. But he ordered that man, Dr. D.W. Yandel, to stay behind to treat wounded soldiers at Shiloh. So Johnston had a personal physician assigned to him who normally would have fixed his wound. But he had ordered that doctor, Dr. D.W. Yandel, to stay behind and treat wounded soldiers. So he did not have him with him. So Johnston's been nicked an artery in his leg, he's bleeding. No one puts a tourniquet on, and his personal physician's nowhere near him because he ordered him to stay and treat the wounded. Well, believe it or not, Tennessee Governor Ism Harris was with Johnson during the battle and saw that he was wounded and kind of guided Johnston's horse and Johnson into a group of trees because he could see that he was wounded. So after being shot, Tennessee Governor Isam Harris, who was with Johnston during the battle, actually guided Johnston's horse into a group of trees, sat down General Johnston, and noticed that his boot was full of blood. And he examined the general, and he couldn't find any wound. Well, Harris gave him the best treatment he could, Governor Harris. He gave him some brandy, poured it in the general's mouth, and Albert Johnson promptly laid by that tree and bled to death. Lost his life as a result of the Battle of Shiloh. That's how little we knew about battlefield wounds at the time. Well, there were some survivors of the Battle of Shiloh. One of note was Johnny Clem, the youngest survivor. Anybody want to guess how old he was and what he did in the battle? What'd you say? He was a drummer boy. He was 10 years old. Can you imagine that, being in a battle like that at the age of 10? So the youngest survivor of the Battle of Shiloh was 10-year-old Johnny Clem, who was a Confederate drummer during the battle. And for his bravery of surviving the Battle of Shiloh, he was later given the nickname Johnny Shiloh. He's actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery, and when we go there,